This is our review session for the exam on Wednesday at class time, as sent out in a several, as in the syllabus, as is reminded you in a couple of memos from our three TAs who are administering the details. They can tell you and handle short-term problems. They'll all be online during the exam if you have a crisis. Write your answers in a Word document, not online. Then if it locks up online, you will have your copy and you can paste it right at the end. Classic, important, obvious suggestion. Always have a backup, always be saving the backups. Never keep a single copy of anything. So be ready, be prepared for lockups. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. Okay. Questions? Any theme, any topic, big, small, theory, empirical, policy, whatever. What's on your minds? Exam has two parts: IDs, short IDs, and essays. As we've written and talked about it, glad to cover any concepts that are not clear. I can comment on some. Many probably, hint, almost everything will be in the syllabus in some way. So start with the syllabus, go through the main parts, look for the big concepts, and those are what you should be able to comfortably comment on.
I noticed on the Canvas website, under like the module section, there was also, it looked like a presentation or like slides of ID terms. Is that also something that would be helpful to look at, or is that not as applicable to this quarter considering?
Yeah, that's fine. I think that was done for an earlier year, but it should overlap. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, because I know that for the third week, or for our third week, it was like kind of different, right? Because we were
okay, yeah,
contemporary issues.
Good point. We switched that from previous years, so we do not have there the social movement section, and everything else is moved back a week, so the weeks don't match up.
Okay, in that case, then I can start with a question regarding the social movement week. When we're talking about like the differences between, can we talk about the three concepts again that McAdams talks about?
Sure.
And specifically, yeah. I guess we can start with like I understand for the most part the political opportunities and existence of opportunities. Some of the difficulties I'm seeing, and I think we talked about these contradictions in class, was the framing the movement or framing the process, which was the third and final step. And we were talking, I remember Luke also brought up during his segment how we see some contradictions with McAdams' conception of what these movements are supposed to look like. But I'm still having some trouble understanding the third movement, or the third part of that. Yeah.
Okay, now framing is a general term. It doesn't have don't worry about any fancy technical definition. It's the same idea as the using the concept of discourse or rhetoric or your view or your interpretation. If you say to Mom, I'm starved, and she says, are you asking if it's almost dinner time? Those are two ways of framing, what time might we have dinner this evening? Okay, that's all we're talking about in that general sense. The most obvious linkages to social movements and to the course is that some people, especially civic leaders, community organizers, political party, program writers, candidates for political office. They will, in debate with each other, try to reframe what they want to see as most central. So I mentioned the Chicago organizer of the NOW, the National Organization for Women, and I invited her to class, and I said, "What are the main things that you do in your job?" And she said, our main concern is to answer the phone calls, the inquiries, and the personal concerns of each person who contacts us better than any other feminist organization in Chicago. And she talked about that for 20 minutes, about how we had phone banks, we had staff who did this and make a list, they put it on a computer. And I said, well, how about the issues that I've heard discussed in Washington of the national NOW leaders about women's rights, equality, trying to spread that kind of general program concern. So well, they talk about that in Washington. That's not our Chicago focus. I mean, I fell off my chair, as I said. That's framing. Even within the same official organization, the Chicago branch frames the issues differently, dramatically in that case. And we can call this, I mean, this grows out of the Chicago clientelist style of politics. I give you an answer to your question, you give me your support. That kind of private exchange of goods or exchange of private goods. Okay, framing we can also use in that example as a social science, as applying different social science concepts. And what's the concept I just used, or the concepts I just used, of public and private goods? I mean, that's, if we just go on to that briefly, is that may not be explicit in the readings, but I've used it multiple times, and it's important for thinking about a lot of these issues. Who developed the concept of public good as I used it there, and what's it say? I've defined it 2 or 3 times in class. Anybody answer that, or I will, but all of you should be able to answer that. What's a public good?
It's something like clean air. It's something that's non-exclusionary, so everyone can have it, even if they don't like necessarily pay for it.
Exactly. Perfect. Example like clean air, shared among everybody and non-exclusionary. You can't exclude people from access to clean air, and you can't charge them a fee if they get it. Those are the key points. And the author of the paper for it was Paul Samuelson, the first most famous, probably economist in the mid 20th century. Say after World War II for sure. Keynes, okay, so I won't go on about that, but I mean that's the quick point. Private goods, by contrast, are what? The public good concept is presented to contrast with private goods. And what's the sort of key definition? And it's a framing issue. And so, I mean, I may not have stressed this explicitly, but I'll just do so now, because it's implicit in what you read in the Adam Smith reading, and we've used it in talking about other interrelated concepts. So the private good, the classic private good, is what's defined by it's a normative definition in that sense of a perfect free market. What's a perfect free market in that sense? How's it different from some other things which Adam Smith talked about? A perfect free market should work through exchange of goods and services. And the key, one big concept for this course is his concept of his interrelated concepts of the division of labor. That is what generates wealth, the division of labor. how can you make the division of labor bigger and bigger and bigger to cover the whole world? That's the idea of globalization. And his term for that was the extent of the market. So if you have a market of a small extent, which is just people in your village, you may barter, you may exchange goods. I mean, I've got wheat and you've got corn, you've got pigs and I've got cows. We can exchange, you know, a bucket of cow milk for something else. You don't need any money. You don't need anybody in the next village. But if the pig dies and the cow dies, does everybody starve, or they only eat grain? Okay, so that's his argument. The broader the extent of the market, the more you can have competition. And if we have perfect competition and information about the price and the availability in the next village, then you can have a more free, more extensive market. And the price should go down. And I'm looking here at page, well, may your pages may not match exactly, but here, just I'm looking at the syllabus. It says globalizing Smith. How can we build these larger markets? It says here, 1B, higher technology for transportation and communication leads to larger markets and shared media access, such as potential globalization. Then the openness of market or linkages can be broader, especially here with wealth, and then views which may become more generally shared. Not right here, but I discussed it later, just bringing it together here, the ideas of sort of types of markets. Later on, we talked about the fourfold classification of what drives prices and production. And the classic factors of production were land, labor, capital, and management. Land, labor, capital, and this is Economics 101. That's really, these are all for mostly private goods. What this left out at the end of the 19th century that the economists began to talk about was that they didn't use the term public goods until the 1940s when Samuelson, but they earlier talked about externalities. You don't need to know all these things. But I would say these are good. These are things not for economics majors. Every generally educated USC student should know these concepts and be able to talk about them with your grandmother or someone, and then they'll say, oh yeah, I know about that stuff. And then you can say, oh yeah, and you can then bring in other theories, but these kinds of framing are things which are useful. Okay, the externalities are, say, dirty air. They're external to the contract of how many red shoes can I get for $3 or for $30? And can I get red shoes or can I only get yellow shoes? That's a question which you pose in a private market context where you will consume the one pair of shoes yourself. They're not shared with your friends, even if you're shopping with your friends and they say, yeah, get the yellow ones there. They go, what would that dress better? The label for this more generally is, if we have, the label is efficient market. That efficient market is a normative conception. It says, it's a framing example. It says the market is efficient if you get a matching up of supply and demand so that the market is smooth and efficient. and we give people as much as possible that we can produce, given the level of technology, of information, of the extent of the market. And it contrasts with monopoly. That is, if you have a monopoly, then the person who is the only person who is producing shoes doesn't have any competition, and there's no immediate incentive to set the price. So you can have monopolies ideally set their own prices. And so the criticism of monopolies is you're not competing. And this is used all the time in Washington now. These big tech firms are monopolies. We therefore in government want to regulate them more because they're not behaving competitively. That's the implicit criticism of government. Is that an illustration of a public good? The private market? No. The fact that they, or let me frame it more precisely. The fact that they are privately owned rather than government controlled does not mean that they're producing private goods. They may produce public goods and public bads. So if Facebook exists, or Facebook puts up things, or let's say Facebook turns off the account of President Trump, is that a public good? You can say it's a public good or a public bad, but yes, the point is it's generally shared. You get access to it. That is, everyone in the US gets access or not access to Donald Trump's accounts. And so the Trump supporters have said, you have acted monopolistically, and this is bad because you're shutting me down in ways that are acting, you're controlling the situation. So that's a criticism of a non-market action. All right, so the point I'm making is public goods and bads can be generated by the government, or they can be generated by private firms and individuals, like that Facebook example. So if we can imagine a fourfold classification where we have public and private analytical goods, and then we can add government and privately produced services. And each of those four boxes have examples which we could fill in. But the point is, private goods are not simply what are provided by government. It's an analytical concept. So high taxes or low taxes are public goods in that they're shared by the tax. The tax table is shared by everybody. But a private good is how much do you pay in taxes? Okay, so, or how much do you personally get in services? Let me be more careful. If you get services from the government, which may be both public goods and private goods. So if you go to a school and you don't pay, it's a public school, you don't pay tuition. So you're getting that for free. So most of the services of government are public goods, but they're more, but they're not. These are not identical kinds of concerns. All right, so that's why it's important. The next follow-up and big important concept, just sort of sticking with market sector here, is amenities. What's an amenity? Simple definition. Amenity is a non-market good. You get amenities not by paying for them. Okay, is a restaurant an amenity? Is it a public or private good, or what? It's both. A restaurant's food that you consume on your plate is a private good. And if you pay for the food and you give it, if you pay for the, okay, here's a good example. If you pay for the food on your bill, that's a private good. If you give a tip to the individual waiter in cash, rather than having it go to the pool of all the waiters and waitresses, that's a little more public good if it's shared. So in this sense, it illustrates the point that public and private is a continuum, and it depends on the extent of the market. And if the extent of the market is the market between you and your waiter, it's a more public shared good if it includes all the waiters in the restaurant. So in many continental restaurants, they don't let you tip the waiter. They don't even show the tip separately. In England, traditionally, that they don't include the tip, and you put it put it on yourself, or you give them cash. But the continental perspective is more collective, and you want to have all the waiters and all the people in the kitchen have access to that same amount of tipping, and therefore they are not purely linked to the person who served you at your table. Okay, so that in a sense is a disincentive to the individual waiter to give as good service as if he knew we were getting a tip. And so those kinds of examples. All right, how is a restaurant a public good, or is it a public good, or is it only a private good? Yeah, Max.
I think it's a public good in the sense that like restaurants enhance public life, right? In the sense that if you're driving, people to an area, or you're improving the quality of life in an area with, vibrant blocks with thriving businesses, outdoor dining, certain other services that they provide, it generates a better neighborhood life.
Absolutely right. Perfect. And you don't pay for that. If you walk by 12 restaurants and you look at their menus and they say, which one should we go to? That's all amenities which are private, or which are public goods. The buzz of an individual restaurant, it may be generated by or indexed, and I'll mention their Nobel major economist here, Gary Becker, who has a paper on this concept we also use called buzz. So buzz, in that sense, is a neoclassical Chicago economics concept, if Gary Becker used it. And his discussion featured the example of a line. If there's a longer line to get into a restaurant, and there are a whole lot of people standing all around in the street, winding around to get in, and there are only a small number of tables, and they're not very, that's a sign of buzz. And it's a publicly shared thing that you can see, and you don't have to pay, you don't have to get in the line, you don't have to pay to eat the food, but you can say, hey, we've got a neighborhood with some really hot restaurants here in, say, New York's Greenwich Village, classic thing. And so you can even pay a private fee to some folks to, hey, I'd like to hire 50 people to stand in line in front of my restaurant because I want to show the other restaurants that I've got more buzz than anybody else. And so you get a mixture of private goods are being, in this sense, corruptly subverting the market. That's a classic definition of corruption, that if you should be doing one thing and you actually are doing something else by giving, say, classically, say, people in that example, money to stand in the line, they're not really waiting to eat there themselves. They're just enhancing the buzz thanks to a tip. Okay. So when we get to gray areas, like was Facebook doing this because of a monopoly because it wanted more control, or was it trying to be responsive to the broadly shared political consensus of the American public? That's a gray area. And so the people who like it will say, well, they will frame Facebook's cutting off Trump as good, as saying this enhances democracy and the respect to the Constitution and the rules of the game for good politics, the critics will say you're acting monopolistic and you cut off, an important legitimate political participant who's supported by half the Americans. So in that sense, we get a framing where, potentially half of the US public could disagree over whether it's a public or private good. So they're gray areas inevitably, and framing is part of all of this. So I'm using not things which I'm inventing in this course, but these are classic basic kinds of things which you all, I'm using examples to make it and showing you some gray examples, but these are things that everybody should know. All right, so similarly, everybody should know about class, say proletarians and capitalists, class conflict, and class conflict can grow if we have more monopoly increasing. So Marx and Lenin stressed monopolistic competition. As you have fewer and fewer firms, they don't pay fair wages. They exploit their workers. They act as monopolies and exploitation rises. Therefore, class conflict increases. The revolution is more likely because of the exploitation of the workers and the rise of the class consciousness. The proletarian framing is what then Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto to enhance. So in this sense, you can use all these framing concepts to talk about some of the same kinds of things as you do, but Marx himself took over core concepts from Adam Smith and from Malthus and from others economists who wrote before him. The big things that I think I mentioned, which he did change, was that Adam Smith had three classes: capitalists, workers, and landowners. Marx dropped the landowners, and in his 1848 or his economic and philosophical manuscripts, just before 1848, when he was still writing for himself. These weren't published until the 1930s. He talks there in detail about how the landowners are bad because they listen to and he especially he has English examples. They talk about nature, flowers, clean air. They write poetry about this. People love being in the countryside. They love working in gardens. This is holding down class consciousness. Therefore, this is bad stuff. And so we're gonna the real parts of landowners is that they are capitalists, like all capitalists. And land is not an important, he says, reframing. So Marx reframed class into a dichotomy, not a trichotomy, as Adam Smith had used. So in that sense, he used Hegel's idea of dichotomies, and then you could have conflict between two, which tends to be more acute and more heightened and is easier to lead into revolution. Okay, so what we're doing in terms of this course, and people are now, say, with the Marxists, Henri Lefebvre and others, are trying to bring place back in more explicitly and talk about land and what's associated with land. And one big example is the restaurant as an amenity. So the Greenwich Village neighborhood with many good restaurants is an example of amenities identified with a place, even if they're not linked with class consciousness or we don't care about the private market dynamics. The restaurants, or the density of restaurants and their amenities, are an important way to sort of capture the place dynamic, or the land, the workings of land, which Marx left out. And so we have a tradition of trying to bring place back in, and I even will, let me see if I can easily show you one little table here. And whoops, no, this thing up. What am I doing wrong? Share screen. And I'm going to show this one thing here, this one little table. Okay, you see this table called Components of Real GDP? Does everybody see that? Say yes or no. Yes, okay. All right. I'm showing you this because this stresses how big, if we talk about capitalism, people think about capitalism as, say, business investment. That's Wall Street. Is Wall Street driving the world and globalization? If we look at the components of the real GDP in the US in 2018, Wall Street and all business investment is only 18% of the GDP. Capitalism is not so big here. How big is the government? 17%. The government is, no, government is the federal government, government is 17%. The federal government is only 7%. State and local governments are 10%. So state and local governments are bigger portions of the GDP than the federal government. Would you ever know that by watching American mass media television and the Wall Street Journal? No. The federal government gets all the coverage. State and local governments do not, but they are bigger capitalists. They're bigger money spenders than the federal government or put together. They're about the same. The federal and state government are about the same as all of business investment. But who's the real driver? Personal consumption. 69% of GDP is personal consumption. Of those, 25% of that, still 25% is goods, refrigerators, cars, computers, iPhones, and 45%, the biggest number in this whole table is the reason I'm showing it to you, 45% of GDP is personal consumption services, restaurants, waiters. That's the huge point of the amenities, that amenities are personal services, and these are what you get in schools. Schools are probably the number one most important in terms of dollars, in terms of importance to parents and kids and so forth. So public schools are probably number one in this, and heatedly discussed and debated about whether they should be open or closed, etc. It's big money. These are big concerns, certainly to parents, but also to others. Okay. All right. So I didn't show that before. It's new, but it frames the importance of the market, and it shows that the importance of the Wall Street market ain't so big stuff. Okay. I'll stop that and we'll go back to anything else. So I've been going through these related big concepts coming out of the first section of the course. Yeah, here we go. 4A, I did have the term here. Market openness leads to efficiency. Efficiency, that's the economic concept. And I'm contrasting it here with the ideal we talked about right at the beginning of the egalitarian ideals undermine the traditional hierarchies of the economy, social, and political. So we're showing that globalization. So then this discusses Marxist capitalist expansion here. So the point we're having here, I'm showing in a neo-Marxist kind of way that the egalitarian ideals conflict with traditional economic hierarchies, such as the landowner. So if we have a landowner, we have a feudal system. that is in conflict with egalitarianism where every citizen is equal. And so I'm illustrating with that point the idea that globalization is not simply Wall Street. Globalization is driven more by personal service, consumers, what people get talking to one another, and that these framing ideas that I like China, China is my nation and I identify it, can grow out of these personal relationships of people talking to one about China and things which define the personal relationships which I have, and that may heighten my sense of nationalism as I talk to more people in China. Okay, that's one way of how egalitarianism can operate in conflict with other hierarchies, or reframe. So the same thing. Is it bad to wait in line in a restaurant? Yes, it's bad if you're wasting your time, but it's good if you want to say, yes, I went to the coolest restaurant in all of New York City after waiting for 2 hours and it was really terrific. Best meal I ever had in my life. Okay. So you can write about that in Facebook or Instagram. You can take photographs standing in line. You can send it to your friends. This is the kind of stuff they fill up in Instagram, say, we're in the line of the most important restaurant right now. And we're still just taking pictures of the line, but wow, is it going to be good? And now here are pictures of the plates which we ate, and these are terrific. So in that sense, you can privatize to your friends the pictures of your food as well as eating it and tasting it. But if it's spread out over the whole internet and it's not just your immediate, that is the extent of your market, which you can change by making it public or private, reshapes the framing of that one restaurant meal. And that what's the number one thing which the Chinese take most photos of, which may heighten their nationalism? This is not an exam question, but it's something it's a good thing to know for everybody. And I don't know how true this is for other countries, but at least this has been studied for China. The things which the Chinese most take photos of is the food on their table. They love to eat. They love to eat as a group and to talk about the food and to take photos of the food and their friends eating together in restaurants. That's the number one photograph on all the websites all over China. And it may be, and I'm sure I don't know if that's equally large for, say, Italy, where the Italians are the same way. The Italians sit for hours and hours and have pasta and talk as a family, either in a restaurant or at home, in ways that the classic alternative is, the classic conflict is fast food. So when fast food came to Rome and Paris, the French and the Romans and the Parisians organized groups called the Slow Food Movement. This was a new social movement fighting fast food and the aesthetic undermining of a proper family relationship, or the aesthetic of savoring food and savoring personal relations was undermined. Whereas the advocates of fast food would say, this is efficient, this is a more efficient market transaction. It's a bad waste of time. It's wasting my private bad to stand in line. I want a hamburger that I can pick up and carry, right out and eat back in my office while I'm sitting at my computer. That's a private good fast food, different weighting of preferences, which says the family is not as important as the individual's time. Okay, so I'm using some of these concepts to show how we can connect them and in a way that I'm not using any fancy economics. All of you should be able to think and talk and frame. So all of this is an answer to the question we started with at the very beginning. What's framing? All this stuff I'm saying is framing. And these terms private, public, personal consumption, GDP. These are simple basic things that are in all the newspapers, but the way you use them, the way economists explicitly, I'll also make explicit in social science, economics, the economists are good in at least invisibly contrasting a normative from an empirical statement. So you can say normatively, a good market, in a properly efficient market should provide in the long term, if we have open competition, freedom of access, perfect information, then we'll get that ideal market price, supply and demand curving and creating an efficient market price. But if we're dealing with, and this is Samuelson's point, and if we're dealing with public goods, you can't have an efficient market because you don't sell things, you don't sell them in a perfect market. And so if there's only one restaurant in one village and there's a line, you can't go to another restaurant. You just wait until the people who are there finish. But if you have 10 restaurants or 100 restaurants, you're getting a little bit more competition, and you potentially, ideally would see, ideally in the normative sense, would see the price go down, and you could get more efficient price and quality of food than if we had just one restaurant in the town. Okay, I've been talking on this maybe too long, but more questions on anything? And I've deliberately tried to come into later sections of the course and show how some of these grow out of normative, positive, as well as criticism of neoclassical economics, including political and social movement criticisms, and the framing which each of those bring. Does framing have to come from, yeah, okay, Mylan, go ahead.
Just a small question for clarification in regards to the timing for the exam.
Yeah, just a little louder. In regards to what?
Can you hear me better now?
Yep, thank you.
In regards to the timing for the exam, how many readings should we have prepared to have themes of? You know, should we create a theme or have prepared 2 readings that want to connect, or 3 or 4? What's the timing of the essay portion?
I think there was one of the notes from the 3 TAs which said, at least, I mean, maybe been said explicitly, maybe 2 or 3 or 3, something like that. Should you have no more than 3 and no less? No, there's not a rule, there's no fixed rule. But I would say, in an essay, you ought to be able to use it at least 3 readings, yes.
Understood, thank you.
Follow up from you or anyone? Or any more general question on anything else? Giorgio.
Is there an essay that this framing word comes from, this framing idea, like one specific paper?
The source it comes from is the first reading on the social movement section, which is the edited book by McAdam and 2 others.
Thank you.
3 concepts, and that's the way it was introduced as a question. Yeah, McAdam, I also mentioned in discussions, did a famous monograph, and what was it about? What was the big point of that? Anybody? It's called Freedom Summer. And what did it show? What's the major public good transformation and framing that was brought into the whole social movement area and much of what we see in life today in the US, not just in the US, but more generally. Freedom Summer was organized by SNCC, the Student Nonviolent was even the name, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. met with the New York Unionists, and they legitimated, if you will, the use of Black power as a normative ideal, and they were fighting with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King's main concern was nonviolence and not to openly conflictually challenge Americans. He tried to build a nationally, broadly tolerant conception of racial integration, tolerance of different ethnic and access to the rights of all those things which all Americans should be able to access. Justice was a clear concern there, a normative concern. These are all public goods which he was trying to appeal to in his framing of racial intolerance. And so the marches they had in highly racist areas and small towns in the South, where you'd have tough police that would beat them up, the media would cover that beating, and then you'd have people in Oregon and California who would vote in favor of the US national government, enforcing more forcefully egalitarianism into the South. Okay, the SNCC people said, we want more, we want different. We don't just want to show that we're Christians or Americans. We want Black nationalism, we want Black power. And that in turn transformed the whole civil rights movement in the US, so that even the organizations, the single organization created by Martin Luther King has embraced more Black power publicly in ways that hold on at the present time. Now, clearly that's framing it as a dichotomy. That's too simple. All these things are a continuum, but I'm simply making the point that if you look at surveys of African Americans and ask questions like, how much do you want to move toward more integration versus how much do you want to try to support local businesses that are African American and so forth, you get a dichotomy. And this is a very central ideologically divisive framing question among African Americans in the US. Mylan, hand up. Question?
Yes, I'm trying to make that connection to the civil rights movement and distinctions between there to Putnam's Bowling Alone.
Good.
In regards to social capital, would it be accurate to claim that bonding was a framework used by the more Black power sector of the civil rights movement, more exclusive?
Yes.
Okay.
That bonding and racially, or put differently, the civil rights movement did explicitly include Blacks and whites together in the bonding. So they tried to show not just Black marchers, but Black and whites marching and asking for equal treatment for all Americans. And so that continues insofar as you have, say, media coverage or organizations which try to show racial diversity in their membership, including Black Lives Matter. I mean, a lot of the Chicago participants in the Black Lives Matter discussions and say in Hyde Park and in the North Side would be whites. But in Bronzeville, I think I quoted to you when the alderman was Toni Preckwinkle and asked her a question about racial integration. She replied, "The only integration I can talk about generally in the ward is economic." She's basically saying the residents of Bronzeville strongly support Black power. More, and I cited that again. I gave you a couple of examples of that, I think, a week or so ago.
Got it. Thank you.
And Toni Preckwinkle, and I contrasted Toni with the two Obamas. Michelle Obama before the first primary, Michelle Obama in her BA thesis at Princeton was basically on Black power. And that disappeared from the library when Barack Obama was writing for presidents. It never got to the press, and so forth. And she then she's never really talked about that kind of stuff. She's redefined what she said in general. And she's been more someone who dances, who takes flowers to the veterans, black and white, and so forth. And her tough Black power side has been played down. But when I worked with her with students, she was the head of the University of Chicago Hospital. She's vice president dealing with civil relations and so forth. And she would meet with USC, white students and others and say, you are racist. You're creating the problems that we have. And these were groups of 10 white students who wanted to work on to improve race relations in South Shore and so forth. She didn't want to talk with them. I was amazed. Or she would talk with them and say, you are racist. You got to change your views, etc. Without asking them anything. Okay. I told you, Coleman Young, mayor of Detroit, came to Chicago and said, you elected prune-faced, to the room full of USC faculty and students. How many of them do you think voted for prune-face? Okay. So labeling your opponents into dichotomies is what, not just Marx, it's a more classic rhetorical and theological device, which may be better for open conflict, which Stokely Carmichael wanted, but others have not wanted. Martin Luther King. All right. Other questions on anything else? Scanning down through the concepts and readings. Bowling alone, that was a good question from Mylan. One thing I didn't talk about, but which is there in the Kalman Clark book on the third sector, which I'm proud of, is to look. I think it's the first section. Look for that is, it's that the idea is what's important, not the precise reference. The idea is that one organization can have multiple goals. And because in a classic question you learn in an organization theory courses, what they all teach, and which they're now recently discussing and say this is bad. Business schools and market consultants will say, what's the goal of the organization? And then what's your goal personally? Are you maximizing your goal? That's a simple kind of crude application of quote, rational thinking. I would say it's not rational. It's stupidly narrow to try to frame things that way. So what we do in the book is say, there are at least 5 kinds of things going on. And this is more true with the third sector. The third sector, what's the third sector? It's not government, it's not business. It's a third sector, including civil rights organizations, including the Boy Scouts, including all kinds of nonprofits. This third sector has more diverse multiple goals, and they're often internal organizational conflicts. And so we're using the 2 civil rights organizations, SNCC and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The organizations may be movement oriented, trying to, and this is in a sense illustrated as well by the National Organization for Women. The national movement had these goals, say, as equality for all women. But the local organization had different kinds of goals. So I'm making the point, within an organization, you can have conflicting goals. So we classify these in terms of things such as professional. So you can be a professional manager and you can try to manage an organization professionally. Or you can um, um, focus more on the movement, such as just to use those two kinds of examples. So I'm making the simple point that that there's a little history of these, a little. I mean, these are big obvious points in the history of types of organizations and of the differences, the big differences between the U.S. and England. That is that it's not the U.S. This comes from, more specifically, New England. It's why the Salem, New England folks are different from the South, and it's the public good, the shared sense of the commonwealth. Commonwealth is almost another label for public good. And so the ways that these are used and these are embedded within organizations, and how organizations can change as you try to redefine them, such as saying, you know, these big tech firms should be more responsive to the public good of the commonwealth. And we, the government, we uphold the commonwealth. And we're going to tell you, Facebook and Google, if you don't uphold the commonwealth, we're going to shut you down, or we're going to fine you, and the European Union is doing this. There are a lot of places that are seeking or actually imposing lots of fines on corporations that violate what are seen as properly framed, normatively upheld by a majority of the voters and the elected officials in the political system. Okay, so I'm simply bringing those in. That conflict among individuals in terms of even the goals of one organization is inherent in our discussions of a lot of this. This is why life is more complicated than the simple dichotomies. And you, as social science students in this course, ought to take that away as a major message. That if you only see black and white simple dichotomies, inevitably that's wrong in social life. And that's why I say, if you then positively try to build a model, so I say, go and look at the social science journals and economics, political science, sociology, whatever. Look at any journal, look for the adjusted R squared, how much variance is explained, that tells you. And you'll find it's about 10% for race, class, gender, national origins, and so forth, even though the rhetoric says it's black versus white. Okay, Max.
Yeah, you've made this point a few times about like the explanatory capacity of in relation to what dynamics.
Sorry,
this,
you're cutting in and out. I don't know if what you didn't before. Is you I guess get closer to your speaker, or to your mic.
Sorry. Yeah, I think the internet was just cutting out, but I was asking, so what is in reference to explaining what, is it only able to constitute 10%? And also, how do we account for the fact that like, it's possible that those 10% it can account for are more important or, you know, intertwined with the like remaining dynamics or like, you know, are like supersede them in certain ways? You know, how do we come to the determination that it's only 10% and of what?
Excellent question. Excellent, righto. And it's a logical follow-up on what I said. Yes, as I said briefly in introducing this, if you have a very small number of cases, such as one person that's black and one person that's white, and they're talking together, and you may explain 100% if you measure race that way. That is, if you only got 2 cases. Or if you have, say, 20 cases. And if your 20 cases are not a representative sample, but they're chosen from people, let's say in Toni Preckwinkle's ward, I said most people support her. She said, I didn't say that, she said, and I'm echoing her. I don't know, and she doesn't know without a survey of the people who don't come to all of the meetings, and it may be that you've got not 100%. That is the national sample representative surveys say we've got about 10%. But if you get a small non-representative sample, that's the reason that I say, let's look at outliers which don't fit that characterization. So I use the examples of William Faulkner, whose hero is an abolitionist, not explicitly, and that term was never used, but he gave away his slaves, he wouldn't fight in the Civil War, et cetera, in the same way that the extreme alternative to the puritanical shared Commonwealth of New England moralism was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who showed, this puritanical New England stuff ain't always so good. See, if we punish in a very intolerant way people who want to be more feminist, was implicitly what he was showing in the Scarlet Letter. So I'm trying to show you, I'm agreeing with you 100%, Max. Good question. Rhetorically and framing, take another example. If we have, say Jesse Jackson, and Jesse Jackson is one of the most articulate and explicitly authored of speeches and of books. So he's published a book with his son, and you can take a look at it, and they will say explicitly, when we're talking to a group of Black high school kids, we tell them, this is a racist America. You've got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Don't work for or expect anybody to give you anything. You've got to work hard, get better grades, be a better student, do a good job on your job, and you will succeed. I mean, that's their sort of Horatio Alger classic American speech to Black high school students. When the same Jesse Jackson, and the same thing is true of the US Conference of Mayors that I consulted with for years, when the US Conference of Mayors, Black or white, go to Washington and they meet with people on Capitol Hill, they say, the cities are about to burn. Some of them are burning. You've got to give us more money or the cities will burn, or maybe the Capitol building will be stormed. This is risky stuff. Give us more money. Okay, those are dichotomizing. Those are rhetorical reframing, trying to create dichotomies where they're really not there, that we don't know what the audience was all around Trump. We know the people storming the Congress were storming it, but we don't know what the views were of people who were in the crowd. We don't know what the views were of the Senate members until they voted. Okay, I'm just mentioning this because this was big news in the last 3 days. There were many people who voted on this in the Senate that completely surprised 7 Republicans who voted, who voted guilty. Okay, so you don't know, and so Max is right, and unless we have more, so the way to frame this is information cost and whether or not we have perfect information. So to make perfectly efficient markets work, you need perfect information, which we never have. The frame is, in the long run, we're all dead. So we never have a perfect market in that sense, but it's a normative ideal, which lets us say, how far are we from exploitation or monopolistic prices? Gustavo Arruda.
Hello. The thing is that I'm not sure what was the 10% statistics related to, like what was it measuring? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
The 10% is what most people talk about in their lives, and therefore what gets measured in survey research questions, such as how often do you go to church? How often do you go shopping? How often do you go to a football game? How often do you go out to dinner? How many times a year in the last year have you done each of the following? So that's an example which is quite straightforward and simple, which is widely used in market research questions. But it's just that those things which are widely used and paid attention to, are you in favor of abortion or not? Do you want more tolerance of, do you want to have a book by a homosexual in your school library? Would you invite a homosexual to dinner? Would you want your son to marry another man? Those are the kinds of questions which are very much in the news and are surveyed and analyzed this way. Other questions from anybody on anything? Ram.
Yeah, just another small logistical question about the exam itself. During the essay, just a small logistical question on the exam itself.
Yeah.
During the essay portion, are we expected to make direct quotes from the readings and like cite them, like the page numbers?
No, you're not expected to. There's, in terms of plagiarism, you should not directly paste anything unless you'd want to quote it. If you do, then yes, you need to put in quotation marks, or you can say, as Smith said roughly, and then you can, semi-quote from your memory, that this is how the divisional can but if you want to, we have nothing new in this class to say about that. The university has, and all universities in the US basically have plagiarism guidelines. You're not supposed to use anything unless you say, this is from, or for instance, you can say, I was in a study group with 5 people and we, we said this, and then you can say, here's what the 5 of us said, and you can paste that. But then you can say, I disagree with the other 4 people in my study group, and I would say, this is my take on this, for instance. So it's fine to develop a list and even a text, but you can't copy and paste the exact wording from a study group or Wikipedia or one of the readings. Yeah, Luke, anything you want to sharpen on that?
Yeah, I mean, so if you all take roughly, let's say 20 minutes for the ID, you only have an hour for the essay. So the expectations are adjusted accordingly. We're not expecting you to have a whole ton of very, precise quotes pulled from esoteric parts of the readings per se. But we're looking for you to use the reading's main arguments, paraphrase, though if you are able to pull out full quotes, fantastic. But using the reading's main arguments to advance an argument that you are making in relation to one of the essay questions, So there'll be a series of essay questions that you will pick, present an argument, make an argument about that essay question, advance that argument with 3 readings, the main arguments of 3 readings. And conversely, if you want, you can use the readings to, complicate, maybe perhaps nuance the case, maybe critique the question, or conversely, use the case in your argument to critique the readings in some way. But we just want to see you engage the readings in relation to the essay question. Does that help, Ram?
Yeah, and that's perfect. Ram, follow up? No, okay, you're just holding a thumb up. I would say the readings, as is explicit in the syllabus, the readings are chosen to create conflict. They disagree with each other. So it's not as if there's consensus among the readings. And so we're using, for instance, the bowling alone and talk about what's supported or not supported in later work from Tocqueville and so forth, or the explicit disagreements among the nonprofits, as I just discussed, of what are the goals of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, etc. Giorgio.
Can you give us a brief summary of what the main idea from Democracy in America is about?
Okay, I would say the bad brief summary is organized groups generate trust and legitimacy. And that's so I showed you a path diagram which basically had 4 models, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that was number 1. And so that is what Putnam in Bowling Alone stresses. The organized groups generate trust and legitimacy. And my criticism of that, as has been and was, as was the, or say, okay, let me follow up. Organized groups, thus, as measured by membership, like the Boy Scouts or the Lions Club, those tend to generate legitimacy. And as membership goes down, that's the point of his book. As membership goes down, as people bowl alone, we're going to lose legitimacy in the whole political system, and it can create a crisis of distrust. And maybe that's one of the sources, Putnam might say, of the election and the success of Donald Trump and of Lori Lightfoot, who have very different personal ideologies, but they're building on distrust. Okay. In that sense, what Tocqueville said, in addition to that narrow summary of his view, is Tocqueville included discussions of something about an idea like the Commonwealth. That is, that statement assumes that people tend to have some degree of shared views. Whereas by contrast, if you say, we have farmers and cattlemen, and the farmers and the cattlemen fight, always those occupational differences may lead to, if they get together, they may fight each other more. Okay, so that's taking a more explicit conflict-oriented perspective. If you come from a part from two villages where you have cattlemen and farmers, they may be in conflict all the time. And if they talk together or they try to create an organization, the organization may fall apart and you may grow, you may, and so I'm looking for or other examples, Black Power, neighborhoods. If you have people living in black and white neighborhoods or Asian neighborhoods, does that lead to more conflict or to more consensus? That's a more complicated question, etc. So what I'm saying is that Tocqueville used, if you look, values, lifestyle, a sense of how things may fit together, and he explicitly contrasted the U.S. in general, especially rural Massachusetts, with his native France. And he said, basically, France, people are in conflict, lots more. They don't form organizations because we don't let them. And the way that they work things out is they more frequently have guillotines and they chop off people's heads. And so that the old regime in the French political system, he's holding up as a bad example of how to build a democracy which will have a more generalized sense of legitimacy. How do we avoid another French Revolution, in a sense, what they're asking? Is that a reasonable, I'm trying to make it clear and simple, but use Tocqueville's own words and own main writings. And the most visible is, infrequently in the book, Democracy in America, he contrasts with his native France. And remember then, as well as native France, refused to permit the creation of voluntary organizations like these little churches we have. Protestants, what happened to Protestants in France? The Huguenots, they were called. A few of them went to America. The others were hung. They were killed. They killed people if they weren't members of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, that's the French intolerant tradition. So okay, more questions on anything else? Just mentioning, I mentioned that I put on the reading list, and I summarized it when we talked about social movements. This book by Christopher Bale, Terrified. So it's not easily, it's, as I said, much is on Google Books and Amazon websites. It's a splendid analysis of how social media spread anti-Muslim views and organized social media, organized groups led political leaders to change their framing of Muslims in the US. The reason I added it is because it's a carefully done social science study and one of very few on this sort of thing. It's simply just, it illustrates you can do these things precisely and carefully at the state of the art of social science, careful analysis. You could probably answer something like that from what, just based on what I've said, but just mentioned that. Genghis Khan, I just added to the syllabus. This is version 4 of the syllabus. I just pasted onto the syllabus the Genghis Khan stuff, and why is he here? I just put this in the syllabus. I said this in this presentation, but it's here in writing now. To why consider empires, plural? Because globalization is not just capitalism and Wall Street, nor democratic egalitarianism. There are many other dimensions, cultural, etc., to at least list here and explore as we proceed in the course. And analytically, hierarchy and egalitarianism are critical, generally associated with all different kinds of things, such as restaurants and families, and how you frame your own family. I mean, he's a MCP, male chauvinist pig. Okay, that's a framing of hierarchy. Okay, why is he a male chauvinist pig? Because he didn't hold the door for me. Okay. So the standards of being an MCP have changed from the years of Genghis Khan. Okay. So having the explicit, that is, we shouldn't just have readings and talk about egalitarianism and the perfections of Putnam and Tocqueville. We need to have some good empirical examples, and the strong example I gave was Genghis Khan. And I introduced Genghis Khan by saying, if we look at a cultural history of Russia, and by city, we have the city of Kazan. That is, we had Moscow, which is eclectic. St. Petersburg was created by Peter the Great as a Western, more egalitarian, more participatory city and ideal. Kazan was created by Genghis Khan and his collaborators, and it today, and the first czar, the czardom was created when the first czar succeeded in capturing this headquarters city of Genghis Khan. It wasn't Genghis, it was Kublai Khan. It was his later followers, and they then recruited anybody from different religions, different backgrounds, and today it's now roughly half. The city is half Muslim. But they live together peacefully, generally with the ethnic Russians, in ways that these hierarchies, and that point illustrates my 10%. That the social background of Muslim and Christian does not necessarily explain conflict at the city level. Other questions or comments on anything? I may be giving you a little bit too subtle answers in some of these questions. That is, you can probably get an A on the exam. That is, give the first clear, simple, obvious questions first and show us you know those, and then you can go on and refine. But you can do very, very well, A in the exam, as I say, by just doing it without a lot of the subtleties. But I mean, I say that because in the last year or so, you all have got, you've got a lot of subtleties in your head. I mean, Max and Ram, you folks are asking excellent, subtle questions. Not everybody is doing so, but I bet the rest of you, this is what Luke and I talked. Luke says, I bet the rest of the students could ask this level. So they're just not bothering. Okay, Max.
So I was curious in reading your like New Political Cultures book, which obviously came out in 1998. Do you see the like trends around new political culture having like continued in the last several decades? Do you think there are any like major changes to that framework that need to be made in reflection of like the events of the last 20 years?
Excellent question, which is basically the answer I gave you was in sort of the first lecture, where I said, if we look at, see the scenes dimensions, and we look at 5 of them called legitimacy, we take the 3 from Max Weber and we add egalitarianism. And I said then, and I'm answering your question now to say, in the last 20, even in the last 20, 30 years, egalitarianism has gotten more and more and more strong, and applying it not just to all citizens or to whites and blacks, but also applying it to animals, to animal rights, to plant rights, to the jungle, to the, in a sense, the environmental movement has pressed some of this in that sense. So yes, I would say the ideals of the new political culture have grown even more strong and faster than I ever anticipated. And I illustrated this by the woman from UIC with her bumper stickers criticizing people who drive SUVs. You know, people, you know, I'm not self-confident because I'm driving an SUV, basically. So, I mean, the idea that you would have, that you put bumper stickers on people's cars with that level of subtlety, I mean, I would never imagine would have happened. But she was doing it. So the extent of egalitarianism is the most visible example. That in turn generates the challenges to leaders that they are not being responsive to the public. And that in turn leads the so-called populist label of the populist leaders. That leads, I mean, so Trump ran, Trump put his initial, when he first ran, you know, he said, Mexicans are rapists. I mean, that was the sentence that which shocked everybody. I mean, he completely violated the egalitarian norm that all citizens, immigrants and persons, you know, all citizens in the world should be treated equally. If you say, you know, one ethnic group is more, it includes rapists, and, you know, you've got lots of American residents, legal or, you know, with papers or not, but most of them have been here for many generations, etc. I mean, that's a huge violation of the egalitarian proper citizenship treatment. It's racist in that sense. So that in that, or it's an ethnic, you know, I won't say racist. It's ethnic. It's bad stuff in terms of classic egalitarianism. So the degree to which, so these populist leaders have strongly applied certain, they've reframed the norms of political public discourse in ways that violate and shock many people. So the most obvious cases, say, for people in the West are the presidents of Brazil, the presidents of the Philippines, you know, where they're proud of murdering drug dealers because Filipinos hate drugs. So it's popular I don't want to push that too far, but because we have, okay, so the simple point it illustrates is more egalitarianism is consistent with a populist form of political leadership, which challenges the slow workings of the democratic process, the workings of the conflict between the branches of the House, the Senate, the state governments, the local governments, the judiciary. All these things of the federal system are deliberately set up to conflict with each other to make it more democratic as a process, but which may be inconsistent with this in a sense is that why the economists like Samuelson have said, if you're dealing with public goods, you're always going to have some people angry and dissatisfied. That's the whole point of why they said, so they're saying we as economists shouldn't try to use these tools of markets to study public goods because they don't work. And it's in a sense, that's why economists stayed away from this for several decades. But economists are now studying this. They're studying all kinds of stuff that used to be just sociology or political science or anthropology, like happiness or how strong are family values or religion, etc. Okay, we are at the end of the hour. We will have office hours for a little bit. And as we have said, feel free to send a specific question to any of the four of us. I'd say maybe send it to all four of us. And the TAs, Luke or any of the other TAs, do you want to add anything else just on the administration as this is our last session before the exam?
No, just feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions, and we'll be in the Zoom, the class time Zoom during the exam itself, the 3 TAs. So if you have issues during the exam, enter the Zoom room and we'll be here. Giorgio?
Do we have to be in the Zoom?
No. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you lose a Zoom connection and the memo from the TAs also said they prefer to use the Zoom, but you can, if a computer crashes, you can email your exam from your Word document, which you have as a backup, send it as an email to all four of us. That's a backup plan, because with a class is big, some people are going to have a lockup and your computer is going to crash. Be prepared. Okay. But we're mostly here to help you. I never have really trick questions which are trying to make you give the wrong answer. We're trying to use the most important, basic, simple things, and answering those clearly and explicitly is where you ought to start. And those can probably give you an A grade. But the essay is where you show your ability to write clearly and to put this together and to think. But you don't have to do, a publishable article, Okay, there we are. We're ending the formal session. We'll continue with office hours. If anybody has specific things you want to follow up on, or as I say, feel free to email up to during the exam